almost like we planned it. Shengwu. Oops.
Ah, please don't do that, Apple. Here we are. Don't do that. Don't send. Don't do this.
Go.
All right.
Shengwu is going to speak. Go ahead.
All right. Thanks so much for coming, and thanks, Sebastian. That was super cool. I mean, just getting to see that data, getting to understand it. This talk, I guess, is sort of really oddly related to the last two talks. This talk is, in essence, partly about figuring out or learning how to think well about what might be going on in auctions and ad exchanges. It's also partly thinking about how using dynamic mechanisms like ascending auctions can be useful because they create good incentives for the auctioneer. So the thought here, some of you have seen this paper before. I've realized in the many times I've presented this, I've been unable to give a sort of cogent, human-readable definition of an ascending auction. I'm making another attempt this time. Please tell me if I'm getting it at all right. That would be tremendously helpful. Okay, so some of you may be aware that there's been some controversy in ad exchanges to do with how auctioneers set prices. So up until about the middle of last year, second price auctions were still reasonably widespread in ad exchanges, and there was a view that these auctions had a transparency problem. Now, this is just a quote from an industry newsletter. The claim that some bidders made is that the auctioneers were letting the bids come in, claiming they were running a second price auction, and then afterwards choosing which price floor they wanted. In particular, you could choose a price floor that was the highest bid minus epsilon. Now, why can they get away with this? Well, it turns out that in ad exchanges, the bidders are very substantially anonymous to each other, right? You bidding on an individual impression don't know the identities of the other bidders, and you receive very little feedback about what's going on. Essentially, you're told whether or not you won the auction, and if you won, you're told how much you pay. Now, this is not only a problem in online auctions. This has been a problem for a long time. You may be aware that there's a practice called Chandelier Bidding that is common in art auctions at Sotheby's and Christie's. And the thought is that in a Chandelier Bidding scenario, the auctioneer is in the front of the room and says, I have a bid for $100,000 for this piece of art. And no human being has in fact placed a bid for $100,000. Now, you might ask, why is this so? Like, don't people need to shout out their bids? It turns out that only happens in the movies. In real-world art auctions, for the most part, bidders arrange secret bidding languages with the auctioneer. They say something like, look, if I touch my ear, that means I'm incrementing my bid by $10,000. This is, in these auction formats, it's really bad to have an itchy ear. This is the New York Times report. It turns out that chandelier bidding is not only permitted in art auctions, it's fully legal. So New York City regulations say that auctioneers are permitted to fabricate bids up to the reserve price of the item. Now, at Sotheby's and Christie's, the reserve price is secret. It's not listed in the catalog. So in effect, this is a regulation with no bite. The auctioneers at Sotheby's and Christie's can, and in fact do, make up bids in these art auctions.
What's the incentive of bidders to hide their bid with their ear and stuff like that?
So the dealers typically say, look, I don't want to give away that I'm, if I'm a serious bidder and I've done my research, I don't want other people to benefit off having done my research. Therefore, I want to hide that it's me bidding. So this is the one bit of data I want to show you. This shows you, for various categories of art auctions at Christie's, how the winning bid was collected. You can see that about a quarter of the time in blue, the winning bid is from somebody who's physically present in the room, bidding typically using one of these secret bidding languages. Christie's will permit you to submit absentee bids free of charge. So Christie's will say to you, look, just tell me your reservation value for the item. I will bid for you as though you were in the room. You can see, despite the fact that the service is offered free, it doesn't happen all of the time. Yellow are bids offered through Christie's portal for internet bidding over the internet. Red are bids that are offered during the auction by phone. So in an art auction these days, you get this quite hurried bank of auction house staffers at the front of the room. They are fielding calls from individual bidders, making representations to the bidders about what's going on in the room, and potentially getting bids from those bidders, getting claims from those bidders about how much they're willing to pay. Okay, so having gone really far into the world, I want to pull us back into economic theory, right? Economic theory has a way to think about incentives to play by the rules. In particular, the idea of incentive compatibility, in essence, is about the idea that nobody should want to break the rules of the mechanism. Incentive compatibility requires that none of the bidders should find it profitable to cheat, where cheating is behavior that can be made to look legal by misrepresenting that participant's preferences, with the proviso that those fictitious preferences should be within certain plausible limits. And what do we mean by those plausible limits? Those plausible limits are typically encoded in the type space, right? The type space in a mechanism design model are the preferences that we think the participants might plausibly have. Now, in many ways, what we want to do is to produce a definition of auctioneer incentive compatibility that runs in lockstep with Hurwicz's original motivation. We are going to require that the auctioneer should not find it profitable to cheat, where cheating is defined as behavior that can be made to look legal by misrepresenting the preferences of the other bidders to one of the bidders. And we're going to again require that the fictitious preferences should be within certain plausible limits, namely those represented by the type space. So here's the thought, right? In a second price auction, imagine you're running a second price auction by telephone, right? You get calls from the bidders saying, here's my bid, here's my bid, here's my bid, B1, B2, and so on. One thing you could do is you could award the object to bidder 1 and charge B1 minus epsilon, right? This is exactly the deviation that people allege that ad exchanges might have done. Now, this looks legal to bidder 1. Why? Because maybe bidder 2's value was literally just B1 minus epsilon, in which case you, the auctioneer, have strictly increased your profit. Now, this is not a new observation. Vickery, in the paper that invents the second price auction, observes that the auctioneer would want to deviate and therefore recommends that the auctioneer find some disinterested third party to run the auction on his behalf. Now, imagine you tried to do this same thing in a first price auction. So you're in a first price auction, you receive these bids B1, B2, and so on. Now, you're a smart auctioneer. You know we're playing the fully separating symmetric equilibrium. So you invert bidder 1's bid to figure out her value. Then you make a take it or leave it offer to bidder 1 of her value minus epsilon. You say, well, aha, I know your value now. How about I sell you the object at your value minus a penny? Now, if this happens, probably bidder 1 brings a lawsuit and she wins, right? She says, hold on, the rules of this auction are that I pay my bid. Not that I pay just any amount you choose after I submit my bid. So bidder 1 detects that you've deviated and has an incentive to call the police. So this is, again, it turns out there's nothing new under the sun. This is also not a new observation. Vickery, in the paper that invents the second price auction, observes that the first price auction is automatically self-policing in a way that the second price auction is not. And our contribution in this paper is mostly to find a way to think precisely about what it means for an auction to be automatically self-policing. So at a high level, the standard approach in auction theory is to say that there's no room to misrepresent. The auctioneer is an automaton that takes in the bids and outputs an allocation and payments. Here we are going to permit the auctioneer to misrepresent any bidder's action to any other bidder. So in some sense, we're taking the opposite and extreme assumption. So we're going to treat the auctioneer as a nexus of communication who makes private telephone calls to each of the bidders, but we assume that there aren't public announcements, and we assume that the bidders can't confer directly with each other. Then we're going to permit the auctioneer to deviate with the proviso that she can only do so in ways that look legal to each of the bidders. And we're going to call an auction credible if it's incentive compatible for the auctioneer to follow the rules of the auction. Okay, so I'll make these precise in a moment. At a high level, this is what we have. We're going to look at the useful benchmark model of independent private values auctions We're going to look for regular IID values. We're going to give the auctioneer a utility function. We're going to assume the auctioneer wants revenue. And we're going to restrict attention to auctions in which only the winning bidder makes any payment. We can relax that, but that will complicate the exposition. Now, in this world, it's well known that there is a unique static strategy-proof optimal auction. Optimal in the sense of revenue maximizing, right? It's the second price auction. The Green-Lafont-Holmstrom theorem tells us, essentially, that this is the only payment rule that is compatible with these two properties. Static, meaning everybody simultaneously communicates with the auctioneer. Strategy-proof in the sense that we've seen earlier. Now, a very natural question is,
Sorry, what do you mean optimal in terms of revenue? You just said optimal in terms of revenue.
so I mean optimal in that it maximizes the expected revenue of the auctioneer. So this is a second price auction with a Meyerson reserve. So second price auctions are not credible by the definition. It's very natural to ask if there is a way to run a credible auction that's static, that proceeds only in one round. And it turns out there is, and there is essentially exactly one. The first result of the paper is that an auction is credible and static if and only if it's a first price auction. So the way you get around this, in the world of static auctions, if you want to make an auction credible, if you want it to be self-policing, the thing you need to do is you need it to be that every bidder, upon making their bid, knows exactly how much they pay if they win. That's a first price auction. Now that immediately tells you that we face a choice, right? We'd like to have these two properties, and in a static auction, we can't have them both at once. So a very natural question is, if we permitted the auctioneer to adopt more complicated communication protocols, to in principle convey information to the bidders at the point where they're called to play, and to ask bidders for information gradually, is it possible to get both of these properties at once? And it turns out that there is, and there's in fact essentially only one way to do so. So the second result is that an auction is credible and strategy-proof if and only if it's an ascending auction. And you should tell me later on if I've managed to define this in a way that's human readable. But essentially, that gives you a trilemma. Here are three properties. I don't want to denigrate the use of static mechanisms. Static mechanisms are frequently vital for logistical reasons, right? You can't run an ad auction in an ad exchange that proceeds in multiple steps because you've got about 50 milliseconds in which to decide who wins and how much they pay, and the speed of light constraint prevents you from being able to do hundreds of rounds of communication, right? So these are all three properties that might sometimes be useful, and we have a trilemma. You can't have all three. You can have any two of three, and picking two of three in the simple benchmark model pins down entirely one of the standard auction formats.
And the first tip is a known result, you said?
Oh yes, this is just the Green-Lafont-Holmstrom theorem, or alternatively, it's a corollary of the Milgram-Segal envelope theorem. Requiring strategy proofness entirely pins down the payment rule using a standard argument. Okay, so we're going to go to the benchmark model. This is obviously a lab. It's not the world. Real auctions are much more complicated. Symmetric independent private values. There's one object. There's a set of bidders denoted N with representative element I. Only winning bidders make any payments. The outcome just specifies who gets the object and how much they pay. The bidders have private values, quasi-linear utility, so that's a utility function UI. Their value, theta I, is IID with some density. We're going to make the usual assumptions that density is continuous, positive, regular. Now I'm going to need a few more things to get this going. These are the new primitives. I'm going to add an auctioneer utility function, U0, for the auctioneer. The auctioneer's utility is just the revenue from an outcome. Each bidder observes whether or not he gets the object and how much he pays. That's an assumption natively about the bidder's physical ability to audit the world. The thought is that you in an auction sort of necessarily know whether or not you win the object, right? There's not going to be, a Renoir painting shows up in your living room and you don't know why it got there. And you kind of physically know how much money is in your wallet, right? We're not going to allow the auctioneer to secretly pick your pocket without you knowing it. So we're going to impose those constraints, but we're not going to impose the constraint that you know additionally how much the other bidders are paying or whether or not some other bidder got the object. Yeah.
But are you allowing the auctioneer to show this information?
We're going to allow the auctioneer to make claims about this information, and it is going to be a question whether or not the auctioneer would find it incentive compatible to make these claims correctly and truthfully.
But that's not the same as showing, because in a sense,
Right.
the auctioneer can tell a very different story.
Mm-hmm.
to each bidder,
Yes.
and these bidders cannot talk to each other. So
Yes.
lots of incentive compatibility.
Yes.
That he could potentially just get rid of by saying, look guys, I'm going to show you everything at the end.
Absolutely. So one way to order the second price auction, right, is to say, cards on the table. I'm going to tell you exactly how much everybody bid. I'm going to put up a big list of everybody's names, where attached to each name is the bid they made. And I'm going to publicly announce, in the town square who won and how much they paid, right? Now, our model is abstracting from that kind of public communication. It's a good question why this public communication of this form is actually quite rare in practice. For instance, it's not actually clear who wins the auctions at Sotheby's, right? It is in fact private, the identity of the winner. And in fact, auctioneers at Sotheby's do not disclose, for instance, the profile of absentee bids they received. Neither in ad auctions are we, do auctioneers typically disclose the profile of bids, not least because a lot of the bidders view that their bid is the result of a lot of proprietary data science of the kind you saw earlier this morning, and perhaps leaking all of that information is leaking something that's valuable to the bidder. All of that is outside our model. Our model is incredibly simple and abstracting from the possibility of public communication, even though, as Laura observes, public communication is an alternative way to audit a mechanism. If we're willing to spill the beans on what everybody did, that is one more way to make sure that the auctioneer can't secretly cheat. And we're going to take it as given here that the auctioneer can publicly communicate and leave sort of unmodeled the reasons in the world why that might be so.
Public communication, I guess, is kind of part of your model when you talk about ascending price auction, right?
So that's a subtlety. The thing we prove is that the ascending auction is incentive compatible in this world, even when you are communicating with each bidder privately over the telephone. So we are binding our hands there as well. We're not letting the auctioneer make some sort of public oral announcement. You can imagine it's exactly like those auction house staffers at the front of the room.
Excuse me. You said it's puzzling that there is no public communication of that sort. But it would sort of be off equilibrium in some sense if the data is available and people could sort of say, I want to see it, I'm suspicious.
Yeah.
So in that sense, not seeing it does not say that it's not actually playing a role.
Yes, that's true. Nonetheless, I suspect that if you went to Christie's and you said, I want to know who won, the Rodin last week, they would not be very receptive to that request. Okay, yes.
But it could be that no one is worried about Sotheby's commitment or Google's commitment. I just
Yes.
I was just wondering if you are worried that people don't trust your mechanism.
Yeah.
And you can show this information. It could be a way of relaxing your problem.
Oh, totally. Totally. I agree that's it is worthwhile to consider publicly producing information. Now, that's not a cure-all, right? Because what I could do is I could invent shill bidders, right? Who insert bids at epsilon below this, the highest bid. And that would, even if I were to publicize it, I may not be able to get caught because, who needs to know who the shill bidder is? So that wouldn't be a panacea, but certainly there is a sort of hidden trade-off here between sort of auditability and privacy that our model is ignoring and resolving just by saying we're in a world of sort of total privacy, total private communication, even though it's undoubtedly important to think about what auctioneers should make public and why and in what circumstances. And we don't have a lot of work right now that gives us great ways to think about that. Some of Piotr Dworczak's work pushes bravely in this direction, but I'm not going to make a fool of myself trying to explain it. Okay. As you might guess, today is Extensive Form Mechanism Day. G is going to denote an extensive form mechanism. This is just an extensive game form, a game tree of the usual kind, except that terminal histories, instead of specifying utilities, specify an outcome. They specify who wins, they specify how much the winner pays. I'm going to restrict attention to mechanisms with finite depth, with no chance moves, and with perfect recall. That's to say you can't club bidders over the head to make them forget what they've done. A bidder strategy in this world is a function from information sets and types into actions. So it's as though we're imagining the randomization over types to happen before the initial node. Everybody comes into the initial node endowed with the private information that is their type. And a strategy just tells me what they do as a function of what they know, both from within the game and their private information, their value. Now, I'm going to be a little bit unusual and analyze not just mechanisms, but protocols. These are pairs consisting of mechanisms and strategy profiles for those mechanisms. So this is, in essence, a communication protocol that says what each bidder should tell the auctioneer as a function of what he's been told so far and as a function of his own private information, right? And what queries the auctioneer is going to make to the bidders in what order, and what information, if any, the auctioneer will provide at the point of making each query. Now, these are a few further restrictions that just serve to clean up the definitions. I'm going to assume that for every history, there's a type profile that puts that history on the path of play, so the game tree has no dead wood. I'm going to assume every information set has at least 2 actions. So if you're called to play, you'll make a real choice. And if you're called to play at some history, you can affect the outcome. These are all without loss of generality, in the sense that if there's a protocol that doesn't satisfy these restrictions that gets me what I like, I can prune away these things to produce a protocol that does satisfy these restrictions that gets me what I like. I'm going to restrict attention to measurable protocols. That just means that the interim expected revenue, interim expected utility, and so on are well defined in the usual way. Okay, so this is the simplest second price auction. Bidder 1 bids 5 or 10. 2, without observing one's action, bids 5 or 15. Now, suppose we're the auctioneer. The rules say we call up bidder 1 and we say, 1, do you want to bid 5 or 10? And 1 says, okay, I'll bid 5. So we put down the phone, we call up bidder 2, and we say, 2, do you want to bid 5 or 15? And 2 says, okay, I'll bid 15. Now, the rules of the game say this is the outcome, right? 2 wins and pays 5. But you like money, so what you do is you give the object to bidder 2 and you charge him 10. Notice, both bidders can come away thinking you followed the rules. 1 says, I bid 5 and I didn't win. Okay, that just means that 2 outbid me. 2 says, I bid 15 and I paid 10. Okay, that just means that 1 bid 10. So both players come away thinking you followed the rules. So we're going to take this thought and just formalize it as a game that includes the auctioneer. So this is a messaging game that sort of embeds within it a communication protocol. So at the start, the auctioneer can either choose an outcome and end the game, or go to step 2. In step 2, the auctioneer chooses some agent and sends a message, where a message is just an information set for that player in the original game, right? So we've got some mechanism, we've got some protocol the auctioneer has promised to run. The auctioneer sends a message that corresponds to an information set in that protocol. That agent privately observes the message and chooses a reply. And what's a reply? Well, it's just one of the actions available at that information set in the original mechanism. The auctioneer privately observes the reply, and we go back to step 1. So it should be clear, if you give me any extensive game form, right, there is a rule-following auctioneer strategy, right? I can start from the initial history, send a message to who I meant to communicate, from the replies update the history correctly, send a message to the next person, and so on, and when I hit the terminal history, choose the corresponding outcome. So the full commitment paradigm just says the auctioneer is committed to, like an automaton, do this, right? The auctioneer strategy that runs the mechanism G. And our partial commitment paradigm says the auctioneer can deviate to any strategy that an individual agent cannot distinguish from the rule-following strategy. And this is what we mean by that. So the auctioneers promise some protocol, and there's some auctioneer strategy that plays by the rules, that runs the mechanism. What does I observe? Well, I is going to observe a communication sequence consisting of messages to player I and the replies that I sent. And eventually, the auctioneer is going to choose an outcome. So the I is going to observe whether or not he wins and how much he pays. So let's denote that observation OI, which depends on the auctioneer strategy, the agent strategy profile, and the type profile. I'm going to say that an observation has an innocent explanation if it's consistent with the conjecture that the auctioneer is following the rules. That's to say there exist types for the other agents, such that the observation that I actually has is the same as the observation that I would have if the auctioneer was playing by the rules, but the other agents had those types. So this is behavior that can be made to look legal to each bidder by a misrepresentation of the other bidder's preferences. I'm then going to call a strategy safe if for all bidders and all type profiles, that bidder's observation has an innocent explanation. And then, as you might expect, a protocol is credible if following the rules is a best response to the agent's assigned strategies. That's to say, if it yields at least as much expected utility as any safe deviation. Cool? Okay. So this is that, right? 1 bid 5, 2 bid 15. We charge 2, $10 instead of $5. That's the innocent explanation for bidder 1. Bidder 1 says, well, what's the explanation for my not winning? 2's type was 15. 2 says, what's the explanation for my paying 10? The innocent explanation is that 1's type was 10. So this is a safe deviation. Now, note that this is in principle, we are allowing not just for the auctioneer to choose different outcomes at the end of the game, but to deviate even midway. The auctioneer can send false messages during the mechanism. She's allowed to adopt any communication strategy that is safe. And in particular, that means that she needs to be careful that whatever messages she sends, she can wrap up in a way such that at every type profile, every agent sees something that has an innocent explanation. Okay, there's a related literature, which I'll mostly skip, but this 2015 AER paper is probably the closest to ours. Their definition is a lot like our definition, but restricted to revelation mechanisms. Now, for their setting, I think this is without loss of generality, but for our setting, this restriction does lose some generality, so we're going to allow extensive form mechanisms. We're going to allow multi-stage communication. Okay, so now we're going to move to the benchmark auction laboratory. A protocol is optimal if it maximizes revenue subject to BIC and participation constraints. It's static if every agent has one information set and is always called to play. Now, this is a definition of a first price auction. It's a little bit weird, but it's not super weird. Essentially, a protocol is a first price auction if it's static, and each bidder chooses some bid from a feasible set of real numbers or declines. The player with the highest bid wins and pays his bid. Now notice that in stating this, I'm allowing myself to set a reserve, right? A reserve is just restricting the feasible set BI, right? A reserve of 100 is just nobody can make. BI only includes numbers above 100. Notice the bids are defined here by their consequences, not by their labels, right? So if we're running an auction where the bids are numbered 100, 200, 300, and the agreement is the highest bid wins and you pay half your bid, that's a first price auction by our definition, because by our definition, the meaning of a bid is that it is the amount that you will pay if you win after having taken that action. Okay. So, yes?
But it's also the amount when you are evaluating what's highest.
Yes, yes, yes. So those are the dual meanings of the bid. They
Completely confused as to why he would have any other interpretation of the meaning of a bid.
So in some sense, we think this is the mathematically right way to think about a bid, right? A way that's label invariant, right? The important thing is that, especially as we've been getting into framing this afternoon, right? If I reframe a first price auction by expressing bids in some other language, it remains a first price auction, right? Because the important thing about a first price auction is the person who wins, each action is associated with an amount you will pay if you win, and the person who wins is the person who plays the action with the highest associated amount. And if you think this is completely natural, I'm completely on board with you. Theorem 1 says this is exactly what you need for the characterization. Assume the protocol is optimal. If it's a first price auction, it's credible and static. If it's credible and static, then it's almost everywhere a first price auction. By almost everywhere, I mean that this description must be correct except for a measure 0 set in the type space. Okay.
Sorry, just to make sure I follow.
Yes.
Between you and Jason, what you added there is a monotonic function of the bid. That's all you added?
Well, so all I'm saying is that in defining a first price auction, I'm defining it using the consequences of the bids and not the labels we choose.
But the labels have to be a monotonic, because how would you know what's higher?
So the thought
Higher bidder.
The thought is each of your actions has a number associated with it, right? And there is a way to associate to each of your actions a number with the property that if you win, you pay that number, and the winner has the highest number of all the numbers submitted.
So the actions are in a way some monotonic transformation of the bids.
Yes, yes.
That's all.
Yeah.
Why would that be objectionable?
I mean, I don't think it is. It's possible here that we're all entirely on the same page.
Except that you thought it was necessary to write this in a funny way, and none of us can understand it.
Okay. So, first price auctions are credible and static. That much is hopefully by inspection, right? Everybody submits their bids. Every safe deviation charges somebody their bid. What's the best thing to do? Charge the highest bid. Why does credible and static imply that it's almost everywhere first price? Well, suppose after you play an action, there are two prices that you might pay. Well, here's a profitable safe deviation. The auctioneer should deviate to charge you the higher of the two prices. Therefore, for each of your actions, there must be a unique price that you will pay if you win, right? Which gives you a lot of the structure of the first price auction. Now, this is a little bit too simple. The real proof must ensure that the deviation is measurable, and there's a little bit of technicality used to do that, but this is the core of the idea. So you can prove that almost everywhere for each action that you take, there's a unique price you pay if you win, whereupon we're entirely in standard terrain. The optimal allocation is pinned down by Meyerson. The envelope theorem pins down payments to almost everywhere, so the winning bidder has the highest bid, QED. Okay. By the by, as we were saying earlier this morning, ad exchanges are switching from second price auctions to first price based at least partially on concerns that the auctioneers are cheating. So nowadays, a lot of display advertising has either switched recently or is in the process of being switched to first price auctions. All right, so now I'm going to try to fill in this last bit of the trilemma. Strategy proof, we've also been at this all afternoon. A protocol is strategy proof if for every bidder, that bidder's, for all opponent strategies, that bidder's strategy is the best response. The goal is to characterize the set of optimal extensive game forms that are both credible and strategy proof. The problem is that there's no revelation principle, right? The auctioneer could make any queries in any order. The agents could receive information when they're called to play. There's a further technical problem, which is that the entire machinery of extensive game forms moves in discrete steps, right? And if I give you a discrete extensive clock auction, that auction can't be exactly optimal. So I'm going to need to do something to avoid that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to just discretize the distribution. And hopefully what we'll see is is a fairly inoffensive discretization. This will mean that ascending auctions can in principle be optimal, and so can many other protocols. For instance, I could just run, in fact, I can get a lot of other examples from Sebastian's talk. 2-pack would be optimal. 2-pack B would be optimal. An auction where a sealed bid auction would be optimal. An auction where I queried you from the top, asking you, is your value 100 or lower, 99 or lower, and so on, and then process this via second price rules would also be optimal. So I'm going to discretize the distribution by splitting the type space up into a grid and have some IID probability mass function defined on that grid. Epsilon is just the gap between adjacent grid spaces. You can make that as small as you like. I'm going to define a pseudo PDF, which is just the probability you're at a grid point divided by the step of the grid. I'm going to define a CDF in the usual way, and a virtual value, which is hopefully familiar to everybody here. It turns out that everything you know about virtual values from the continuous case applies essentially in the discrete case. And if anything is off, it's off by no more than epsilon, where epsilon is the grid increment. So I'm going to assume, as usual, that the virtual values are regular. That's to say that this function is strictly increasing. I'm also going to need to deal with ties. And just for technical convenience, what I'm going to do is I'm going to assume, essentially, that if David and I are such that whenever our bids are tied, David wins. So if our bids are tied at 50 and David wins, that means that if our bids were tied at 60, David would also win. So an auction is orderly if for some reserved row and some strict order on the bidders, bidder I wins the object if and only if his type is above the reserve. And for all other bidders, his type is more than that bidder's type, where we break ties using this fixed tie-breaking order. Ties can become really unlikely if you take epsilon small, but we need to deal with them somehow. OK, so with all that set up, this I assert is a credible strategy-proof auction. At the start of the auction, I don't know what each bidder's type is, so they could be anywhere, red and blue. I set an optimal reserve using the usual formula. I call up red, and I say, hey, red, will you bid the reserve? And red says, sure. Then I call up blue, and I say, hey, blue, will you bid the reserve? And blue says, sure. Then I call up red, and I say, red, blue has matched your bid. Will you raise your bid by epsilon? Red says, sure. I go back to blue. Blue says, sure, and so on, and so on. Now, eventually, I call blue to say, will you raise your bid? And blue says, no. Blue has quit. This is exactly his type. What's going to happen? Well, red will pay the least type associated with his bid so far. That's to say, that's his payment, right? That was his last bid. He's now won. That's his payment. You notice that, like a first price auction, at any point, if this protocol ends without me querying you further, you know exactly how much you're going to pay. And that, it turns out, is key to make the protocol credible. Now, a natural question is, why not chandelier bid? Because it is permissible, right? A chandelier bid is, in our model, a safe deviation. Why not raise one's price by epsilon, falsely claiming 2 was still in the auction? And the answer is, you don't want to do that because one's virtual value is positive. So one's bid B1, why not ask him to bid B1 plus epsilon? Well, the rules require that one pay B1. What would happen if we chandelier bid by epsilon? This is the probability that one's type is exactly B1. Well, if his type is exactly B1, doing this means he quits. And that means we can't make any revenue safely. So we lose B1. On the other hand, this is the probability his type is strictly above B1. If we do that successfully, then we've raised revenue by epsilon. But this should look familiar. Divide through, and we've just got the negative of the virtual value. It turns out that the virtual value is the expected loss from chandelier bidding by epsilon. And so because we're above the optimal reserve, it's not profitable to chandelier bid. Now, this is not quite a proof, because we actually do need to deal with a much richer class of deviations. You don't just chandelier bid by epsilon. In principle, you could chandelier bid by more than epsilon, or you could hold a bidder in reserve and run the other bidders against each other, keeping this bidder in your back pocket. The rail proof can, in principle, deal with that. But now I'm just going to try to give you the generalization of that 2-bidder protocol I just showed you, because this is the thing that characterizes credible strategy-proof mechanisms in general. So a protocol is an ascending auction if. I'm going to start by describing sort of global properties that don't have directly to do with the game tree. If the induced allocation is orderly, and the induced payment rule has threshold pricing. What do I mean by that? I mean that each bidder pays the lowest type he could have reported while still winning the object. So if you don't win, you pay nothing. If you win, you pay an amount equal to the lowest type you could have reported while still winning the object. These are joint restrictions on the mechanism and the strategy profile. Now I'm going to describe the extensive game form. The extensive game form works like this. Each bidder has an initial bid equal to 0, and at each non-terminal history, some bidder is called to play and is offered a set of prices, where all the prices are at least his current bid. So this is an ascending auction in the proper sense. The available actions either accept one of the offered prices or quit. If you quit, you're not called to play again, you do not win, and you pay 0. If you accept some price P, then we update your bid to P. I'm going to additionally require that each information set there is typically a unique price offer and a unique accepting action. That's to say there's only one way you can go forward while still keeping in the auction. Typically is because in some circumstances, if you're the unique active bidder left and you haven't yet bid the reserve, I can give you multiple ways to multiple actions that bid the reserve without changing credibility. But for the most part in the game tree, it's fine if you think of this as being unique. And at each terminal history, the winner pays whatever his latest bid is. So like a first price auction, you pay the last bid you placed if you win. Okay. So that's a class of game trees. It turns out that's the whole class. Assume the protocol is optimal and orderly. It's credible and strategy proof, if and only if it's an ascending auction. And that gives us the trilemma. And pretty much the rest of the conclusion is faff, so I'm not going to go through that faff. But the core thought is this, right? The core thought is that ascending auctions hide information. They hide information because when you bid 100 in an ascending auction, all that the auctioneer learns is that your value is greater than or equal to 100. That makes it risky for the auctioneer to cheat, because when the auctioneer cheats, she runs the risk that you quit. And it turns out that in the simple Meyerson model, that risk is exactly enough to make sure that the auctioneer stays on the straight and narrow, to make it incentive compatible for the auctioneer to follow the rules. Now, there are many important desiderata that our model leaves out, like the possibility of public communication, like the possibility that the values are, interdependent or affiliated, and all of those are important. But we think it's kind of neat that, in some sense, these three atomic auctions can be characterized in terms of three simple properties, and that they give us a way to think of trade-offs between the logistics of running the auction, giving good incentives to the bidders, and giving good incentives to the auctioneer. Yeah?
What you said earlier, I gather it seems a particularly interesting part of the result comes from the fact that your communication is private with the bidders.
Yes.
On the other hand, efficiency depends on how small epsilon is. And
Yes.
for small epsilon, this will require a huge amount of communication.
Yes.
So
Yes. And absolutely, right? One reason why you can't run ascending auctions over the internet, right, is that if you're doing something in an ad exchange and you communicate 100 times, you're losing 15 milliseconds each time because of the speed of light, that person has moved on to another page, right? That's a real logistical constraint. Yeah?
So it seems pretty critical that the decision for an agent to quit is irrevocable.
Yes.
Otherwise, an auctioneer could put in a chandelier bid, realize that it has failed, and then come back down and induce the bidder to re-enter.
Absolutely.
Is it the case that you lose credibility altogether, even in first price auctions, if there's that sort of behavior? And then is that sort of behavior observed in art auctions?
So I guess there are two things to say. One is that the characterization theorem says that were you to make quitting revocable, the auction would not be credible, right? That the fact that quitting is irrevocable is key to making the protocol credible. The second thing is that, in fact, That is the one part where where the New York City regulations have bite. If the object is bought by the house, the regulations require the auctioneer to represent afterwards that it has been bought by the house. And the auction houses themselves say if we've bought something by the house, so a chandelier bid has won the auction, that object is burned in the sense that we will not offer it for sale for a period of at least several years. So there are some things that do help make these less revocable out there in the world.
That's considered we have been caught cheating, or that's a legitimate?
So some bidders are very unhappy with chandelier bids, but typically not the experienced bidders. The experienced bidders understand chandelier bids may be there. And in fact, in our model, chandelier bids would just be one more way of enforcing a reserve, right? It would be incentive compatible to chandelier bid up to the reserve, but no further. So ironically, the New York City regulation, which I'm sure was not built with game theory in mind, is exactly the thing that would have been incentive compatible, namely that you're allowed to place chandelier bids up to the optimal reserve.
Why don't we thank Shengwu and we'll go for coffee.